Optical storage is next, and hard drives. So optical storage. Here's a few rules about optical storage. I don't think that it's a bad idea to burn disks anymore. I think that it's still a good idea, just because then you back up on multiple formats, not just a hard drive, not just a flash drive, but potentially on a disk as well, even though they don't last that long. Handle disks on the outer edge or the center hole use non-solvent-based felt tip marker because, as we mentioned, all of the data is held on the top of the disk. Keep dirt and other foreign materials off the disk. Store in the plastic jewel case. You really want to store them book style, standing on edge. And you want to store them in a dark, cool environment with less humidity, because if you stack them like pancakes, pretty soon over the number of years, the discs themselves have sort of drooped and warped because they're just plastic anyway. And so when they spun, they would wobble, and when they wobble, then they wouldn't read the data properly. Never use adhesive labels. So if I'm doing a backup for long-term storage, I never put a label on it. I never write with a Sharpie on it. I never do anything with it except put it in a jewel case and make sure that the jewel case is sealed from light. So I keep the front cover in it, and then I stack it on edge. If I wanted to write on it, I'd write on the case to identify it. Do not scratch the label side of the CD. That's really bad. That's where the data is stored. Never use a pen, pencil, fine tip marker. Actually, I've heard stories of people using Sharpies, and ink itself has a solvent in it, and it can eat through the lacquer coating around the disc, and it can destroy the reflective layer. So you lose your data that way, and never try to peel off a label. I've done that before, where you put a label on, it's a little crooked, so you try to pull it off and reposition it, and you pull off, oh, there's my data on my label. And all there is a plastic disc that you're looking through. Migration of media. The life of the medium may exceed its useful life. So you may actually be on a storage device that outlasts its useful life, meaning the programs that can read it have changed so drastically that you have to keep on migrating it, and the recommendation is every 5 years to migrate it to a new medium. Not only because of deterioration of the storage device, but also because the program information keeps changing. Just look at Apple. Every 6 months, they've got a new operating system. So everything keeps on upgrading all the time. I did a lecture for the National Oral History Society in Bethesda, Maryland, and the Library of Congress is there. And I was able to go to the National Archives, and they gave me a special showing. It was really amazing. And so I got to talking to them about preservation, because that's their whole thing at the Library of Congress, is preserving this stuff for future generations. And then they walked me through, we were walking through, he goes, this is the presidential room. And so we walked through here, and there's like, oh, this is Washington, and it goes every Jefferson, Lincoln, and there's shelves and shelves of books and documents that were used in their administration. I just walked through the archives, and it was interesting. I go, well, I'm getting to the point of the story. So I said, so why is it that Washington has like 8 shelves and Lincoln has 8 shelves, but by the time you get to like Carter and Reagan and all these guys, they have 4 shelves, 2 shelves. I guess it started with Kennedy, where it started getting smaller. And then they were down to like 1 shelf. And they said, well, email and electronic mail. So now they're just emailing and instant messaging. And so there's nothing written that they could preserve. So what are you going to do? He goes, well, we're trying to pass this legislation to make sure that every email was actually printed on paper so that they could preserve it and store it for historic purposes. So I started thinking about how that relates to what we do in music and preservation of data. And then they showed me when people send in CDRs for copywriting, copyright my song, you send in a CDR with the form and $20 or whatever, and it's on their shelves as proof that you wrote it at this time, and you get a time-dated stamp on your document to show when they received it, so that if you were first with the song, you could prove it in court and all that stuff. And they said, we're kind of freaking out because CDRs only last 7 years, and look at how many we have. And it looked like miles of shelves with all these CDRs that people sent in for copywriting. And he said, That's not the last of it. We've got like 47 miles of shelving all over the country, under mountains, all sorts of places and locations that humidity and temperature controlled and all this stuff. And they're trying to save it, but it's all disintegrating. And that brings me to the example of the digital storage and how the records that they thought were permanent, once it went digital, everyone said, oh, it's permanent now, it's forever, it's digital. And they had these 9-track digital tapes on these big old computers that are the size of like washing machines except double high and all that. And those 9-track tapes hold all sorts of information, like where nuclear waste is stored, like prisoner of war information, all sorts of. Have you ever thought about all of the information at the DMV or your bank? All the digital information, if they lose that, what happens? And I read this article written by the Library of Congress called The Digital Wipeout, where the storage mediums won't be able to store them because the digital data is so momentary. And if they do, then how do they migrate to the next system that can understand it? So they have these same problems except times 1,000 that we have. And so I was there lecturing on basically tape preservation and historic preservation and data storage. I realized this problem is so enormous, and it's not just our country, it's everybody. And it's not just the governments, it's also big business, all of the corporations. There's all sorts of RAID mechanisms where they've got multiple hard drives all recording the same data in case one goes down. And so I sort of thought about that, and since I had this accident with my hard drive, which was my own fault because I didn't back it up, I became absolutely neurotic about data storage